Bells rattle across Rome as night kneels to dawn. In the candlelit nave of St. Peter's, a young scribe named Leo slips beneath stone saints, clutching a sealed scroll that could unmake a pope. Outside, armored men whisper the emperor's name, Otto, while inside, rumors coil around the altars. One Roman family choosing popes, exiling enemies, ruling the holy city like a private estate. Leo hesitates, then breaks the seal. History doesn't scream, it scratches, ink on parchment, power in the dark. This is how Rome's so-called pornocracy shook the papacy, and why it still matters. Today we're opening a locked chapter of Rome, when a powerful clan bent the papacy to its will, and an emperor marched in to take it back. Thoughtful. What really happened? How did it work? And why did it nearly break the church? Settle in, keep an eye on the receipts I put on screen, and remember, history rarely shouts, it leaves clues. Let's read them together. If you enjoy learning the hidden truths of history, please tap like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows of the past. Comment below and tell me where you're listening from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity.
Rome in the year 904 is a riddle of alleys and altars, where noble houses muscle through the crowds like ships against a current. The family everyone whispers about is the House of Theophylact. Theophylact himself, Magister Militum, his wife Theodora, as poised as a blade, and Marozia, their daughter, sharp-eyed, unafraid. When Sergius III rises to the papacy, some call it providence and others call it arrangements. I am paid to write, not to decide. In the chancery, I see their names pass like weather fronts across petitions. Favours granted, positions promised, enemies cooled into obedience. I learn how power really moves, not in thunderous decrees, but in the soft friction of introductions, the gift that binds, the silence that saves. Rome pretends at holiness while haggling over holiness's keys. One evening, Theodora's steward leaves a sealed note for the Pope. He doesn't notice me in the cloister's shadow, but I note the seal, ivy leaves, their family sign. I should forget it. I cannot. The city's rumour is that the house does not merely advise popes, it chooses them. The rumour has a second verse. What is chosen may be unchosen. When a priest named John begins to appear at Theodora's salons, gentle voice, strategic pauses, sea grey eyes, I copy his letters too. He is praised for wisdom, for alliances, for knowing which barbarians to keep as friends until they become problems. It feels like watching chess in a smoky room. Pieces advance and vanish. Someone coughs. No one admits who is playing. By 9:10, Rome wears its factions openly. At the markets, a butcher blesses your meat with 2 fingers and a 3rd finger for insurance. Pilgrims iron their faith with relics. Nobles iron their will with militias. Theophylact's men police bridges and tolls, and his daughter Marozia begins to host gatherings that smell like cinnamon and strategy. Guests drift between icons and low-voiced promises. I am sent to record donations, but come away with a lexicon of glances. John, now John X, rises later. Too quickly, some say. He speaks of pushing back the Saracens at Garigliano, of rallying Italian princes who share little but their suspicion of each other. In his presence, I see something dangerous. Charisma, welded to purpose. He listens the way a locksmith listens to a stubborn lock. Theodora smiles at him like a patron at a sculpture that is nearly finished. Marozia measures him differently, as if testing the reach of his shadow. The papal palace breathes with new confidence, while the house measures the windows and the exits. Rome learns a new proverb. Influence is a tide. If you stand still, it drowns you. I copy a letter ordering resources for the campaign at Garigliano. Ships, provisions, stipends for mercenaries with loyalty no thicker than their pay. I write until my fingers ache, then deliver scrolls through corridors that smell like beeswax and wet wool. That night, I dream of maps, rivers that won't stay in their banks, banners that migrate like birds. I don't know yet that victory is also a currency, that the one who pays the army with triumph will owe someone more than thanks. I only know that John's star ascends, and every ascension throws a new shadow. If he is Rome's sword, someone intends to hold the hilt. The summer of 915 burns the Tiber down to metal. I ride with messengers, dust in my teeth, carrying John's summons to princes who distrust one another but hate the Saracen stronghold more. On the plain near Garigliano, banners stud the horizon like stitches in wounded sky. Lombards, Byzantines, Romans. John moves among the tents without pomp, placing words like wedges. Here, a promise of spoils, there a vow of shared glory. I watch men who would not share a table agree to share a battlefield. The battle is a grindstone. Smoke turns noon to evening. Our lines swell and falter and surge until the Saracens, starved of water and hope, break toward the marsh. We press. I learn how victory sounds. Not trumpets, not hymns, just the collapse of resistance, a long exhale, the clatter of dropped blades. Rome will sing about Garigliano for years. John rides back wearing dust and a reputation that smells like myrrh. In the city, bells riot. But even as the victory dais is built, Marozia takes down names. Captains who grew too beloved, clerics who smiled too widely, officials who forgot who opened their first door. Triumph is a roster. It must be edited. In the Lateran, I copy thank you letters that feel like receipts. The House of Theophylact smiles, but between their smiles, I sense arithmetic. John has become more than a client, less than a partner. The space between those two is where dynasties make history, and enemies. Late one night, I see Theodora alone, hands open over a candle, as if warming them at a small fire. The city needs order, she murmurs, not to me, before it mistakes the sword for the law. Then she pinches the flame, and I am left in the dark with the echo of that sentence. Victory breeds certainties and accusations. John X governs with a soldier's tempo. Fast, decisive, sometimes deaf to the side rooms where favours multiply. Marozia expands her influence like water, finding every crack. Wardenships, marriages, patronage over shrines and guilds. When Alberic I of Spoleto rides into Rome with a swagger borrowed from mountains, she studies him, then marries him. The alliance is not a kiss, it is a contract written in iron. Shadows lengthen between John and the house. I copy memos thick with subtext. Requests delayed, audiences rescheduled, guards reassigned. Rome learns new synonyms for no that sound like weather. Perhaps later. The roads are flooded. The Holy Father is indisposed. At a feast, I witness smiles glazed like fruit. The knives are in the kitchen, and the kitchen is everywhere. One night, the palace doors thud shut. Rumours rush ahead of facts. Arrests, a confrontation, the Pope confined. I carry a letter to a monastery where John's allies gather in tight circles, voices low enough to bruise the air. Before dawn, I'm told to burn my draft so that no trace remains. I do not. I am a scribe. Paper remembers. When John X is removed, officially for reasons that sound pious and administrative, Rome does not riot. The city has learned to applaud transfers of power as if watching actors change masks. Marozia's star brightens. Theodora recedes into rooms where decisions are made by presence alone. I glimpse Marozia at the palace balcony the morning the city accepts her arrangement. She doesn't wave, she counts. I realize then that Rome isn't drifting. It is being rowed, and she has both oars. After Alberic I's death, Rome rearranges its furniture. Marozia is no widow of retreat. She fortifies her web with a second marriage, this time to Hugh of Arles, a king who wants Italy, like a hawk wants a field. The wedding glitters. but old loyalties clatter in the corners. Alberic II, Marozia's son by her first husband, bristles at the new stepfather wearing his city as a gift. I copy oaths that taste of iron, fealty, mutual defence, inheritance clauses that braid crowns with mitres. In the streets, the people call it fortune. In the barracks, they count arrows. John XI, young, serious and rumoured to be Marozia's choice, takes the papal chair. Processions lengthen. Silks replace wool in places where humility once sat. The crisis bursts like a storm. A scuffle at a banquet turns into a siege. Alberic II rallies the city's militia and corners Hugh in the palace. The stepfather escapes through a garden, scrambling down a rope like any man who has misjudged a household. The crowd roars, not for blood, but for reordering. They want Rome ruled by someone who speaks their accent. Marozia disappears from public view, removed, imprisoned, or retired to a cloister, depending on who tells it. Alberic II takes the reins not as a usurper, but as a son stepping into a room where the chair was always his size. John XI remains pope, but now the papal palace shares a wall with Alberic's will. I sit awake that night, listening to a city breathe after a sprint. Power has a new address. The lesson is brutal and simple. Alliances can be rented. Blood is bought once and forever. Rome under Alberic II is a city with its jaw set. He styles himself Princeps et Senator Romanorum, guardian of Rome and, by proximity, of the popes he allows to sit. He doesn't rail at clergy, he domesticates them. I watch him standardize market levies, repave stretches of road, and post penalties for soldiers who drink on duty. When he walks the forum, people step aside not in fear, but because he moves like a column already placed. The papacy cycles through men of piety, learning, or convenience. Each is valid. None is sovereign. I copy the most audacious document I've ever seen, an oath that upon Alberic's death, the leading men of Rome will support his son Octavian to become pope. The ink dries like a prophecy. At home, I tend my mother's failing lungs and wonder what a city owes itself. Stability tastes like ash if bought with a muzzled conscience, but chaos devours widows faster than wolves. Alberic seems to know this. He feeds Rome order until she calls it bread. In a courtyard, I glimpse Octavian, a slim teenager practicing with a hawk and a prayer at the same time, as if both were forms of control. He grins easily and listens rarely. Pages adore him. Clerics worry. He is a promise sharpened into an ultimatum. When Alberic II falls sick, Rome trembles the way a servant does when the head of the household coughs. He dies with a city half grateful and half afraid. The oath awakens. Men who never believed in destiny ride to the Lateran to make it happen. I put my stylus down and whisper to the doorframe. Remember this moment. The wood will outlive my bones. The oath becomes flesh. Octavian, scarcely 20, takes the name John XII and the papal throne with a flourish that would have carried any stage. Rome crowds the processional route, whispering two futures, salvation by youth or ruin by it. He blesses like a prince, broad strokes, confident smile, eyes searching not for souls but for loyalties. Administration bores him, prestige does not. He inherits a map with monsters at the edge, Berengar II in the north, restless nobles everywhere. When the sands shift under his dignity, he looks across the Alps and finds a mountain. Otto I, king of the Germans, patient as granite. John invites him to Rome, to be crowned emperor in exchange for protection. It is a brilliant bargain for a day, a dangerous one for a decade. I copy letters that glow with ceremony, silver leaf ink for the emperor-to-be. In taverns, Romans chew the gristle of the decision. Bring a foreign king to save us from our neighbours. It is like hiring a wolf to guard the lambs from foxes. Marozia is gone from public life. Theodora, a memory in polished stone. Yet their architecture remains. Rome still governed as a family business where cousins buttress altars and nephews inherit missions. John XII plays the game as he found it, only faster and with music. When Otto arrives, iron follows, disciplined troops who march like a single argument. The coronation in 962 is splendid, the caution afterward is colder. Emperor and Pope smile for frescoes while measuring each other's reach. The city learns a new weather pattern, bright mornings, thunderheads by evening. The day after the coronation, laws wake up. Otto issues edicts to steady the church and leash its wolves. He wants bishops chosen for order, not for nephews. John XII hears order and tastes intrusion. They begin a dance with iron shoes. I carry notices between palaces that read like threats dressed for supper. John, impatient with imperial fingerprints on Roman affairs, renews flirtations with Berengar II and other restless powers. In private, he plays the old Roman tune, keep every door half open, every rival slightly overpaid, every ally believing he is indispensable. But Otto came to Rome allergic to ambiguity. The emperor convenes a synod in 963. The charges against John are read with a lawyer's chill. The defences are puddles on a hot stone. John flees the city, temporarily, choosing absence over argument. The synod declares him deposed and proclaims Leo VIII Pope. The room exhales as if a page turned itself. Rome splits its voice. Some nod to imperial authority. Others hear an axe striking a sacred root. I watch old men who survived 3 popes in 5 years suddenly look older. I copy the synod's decisions, each letter a pebble in a landslide. That night, I pass Otto's encampment. Fires move like constellations on the ground. He sits with maps and men who speak little, deciding how deep to anchor in a city that loves only its own storms. Power seems less a crown than a yoke. You can depose a man, you can't erase his supporters. When Otto leaves Rome to tend the empire's other fires, John XII returns like a rumour that proves itself. He rides back with loyalists who still prefer a Roman storm to a German winter. Leo VIII vanishes into the crevices between legitimacy and survival. For a few months, Rome exists in a paradox. 2 lines on the same page arguing they're the only sentence. John convenes his own synod, thunders against his enemies, and reasserts his office with a young man's impatience for aftermaths. The city, used to contradictions, shrugs and goes to market. Then the story turns on a hinge no statesman can plan. John XII dies suddenly in 964. The manner of his death multiplies in alleys. Some swear it was a stroke, some whisper scandal. I record neither. The ledger will say what 7 words can say without lying. John XII died. The throne fell vacant. The vacancy is not empty. It is a corridor full of men pacing. Imperial supporters restore Leo VIII. Roman factions grumble and adjust, like a house that moves its weight to a different beam. I feel the city's heartbeat slow from sprint to jog. In the scriptorium, I clean my pen and find my hand trembling. We built this story with people: Theodora, Marozia, Alberic, Octavian. Then one by one, the city edits them out and keeps the machinery. It isn't a family now, it is a habit. With Leo VIII re-enthroned and Otto's shadow lengthening over the Tiber, Rome rediscovers the utility of rules. Appointments begin to carry fewer cousins and more competence. Charters learn to spell consent. It is not virtue, it is equilibrium. The city has been shaken hard enough to taste its teeth. I visit the Cluniac monks lodged temporarily near the Aventine, soft-voiced men with iron habits. They speak of reform as if lighting a candle. Celibacy enforced, simony refused. bishops chosen for holiness rather than households. Their words feel like rain after a long season of smoke. Whether Rome will accept their weather is another matter. When I walk past the old houses, the Theophylact's palazzo seems smaller. It still stands, stone does, but its aura has thinned. They did not fail. They taught others how to do what they did, and those others wear crowns. The game went imperial. In the ledger where I keep my private notes, I write, "The so-called Pornocracy ended not with a crash, but with a reallocation. If later centuries call this a dark age, it is because they need the darkness to show their own light. But in these streets, I see something humbler. Bakers opening before dawn, guards posted sober, children racing the length of a ruined forum as if it were their private circus." Years later, a traveller hands me a chronicle by Liutprand of Cremona. He writes like a man sharpening a blade for an enemy he still expects to see at supper. He loathes the Roman nobility. He admires imperial gravity. He tells our story with a novelist's relish for humiliations and a bishop's certainty about moral weather. I flip the pages and hear an old city described by a sharp-tongued guest. He confirms some things. John XII's rashness, Otto's steel, a carousel of popes, and the hands that spun it. He colours other things until they bleed. Marozia becomes an emblem more than a person. Theodora, a rumour-given embroidery. I've learned that paper can bruise people worse than fists because it never heals. We debate in the chancery. Which sources will future centuries prefer? The scandalous ones, of course. A clean administration has no plot. But I keep thinking of the market women who counted coins under the dark century and would have laughed at the drama if bread was cheap. Stories are made of calamities. Cities are made of errands. I sharpen a goose quill and begin my own record, not to contradict Liutprand, but to complicate him. I write of oaths and gardens, of letters burned and one letter kept, of battles that mattered and banquets that detonated, of a mother whose lungs failed in a winter that also ended a dynasty. A city is not a villain. It is a room full of bargains. I want that remembered. I am an old man now, and the Lateran smells like every decade I've lived. Smoke, wax, lime, rain. Pilgrims still arrive to touch stone. Emperors still rise to test it. Otto is long gone. So are the women who taught princes how to move a city without an army. The word pornocracy survives, tossed by those who love tidy villains. I have stopped fighting the word. I prefer to wrap it in details until it can no longer parade as a conclusion. If you ask me why that era shook the papacy, I'd say, because the church learned it could be governed like a household and discovered what that cost. Because an emperor decided that Rome's keys and Rome's streets should not be held by the same ring. Because oaths swore a boy into a throne, and then mortals discovered that boys become men faster than cities become just. You want an ending. Endings are merely the last room we can afford to heat. The reforms people whisper about now, celibacy enforced, simony scourged, elections pried from cousins' hands, will take generations. But the hinge moved here. The dark century taught Europe that holiness cannot be outsourced to families and power cannot be rented without paying later with interest. Tonight I will blow out my candle and leave this ledger where another hand may find it. If he reads it in a century, he will find the dust of my breath caught between pages. That is the only immortality a scribe deserves, to prove that someone watched and wrote what he saw. The ledger smelled of smoke and rain when I first opened it without my master. Leo had gone to God the week before, and the Lateran felt like a room missing a window. I am Matteo, once the apprentice he teased for blotting margins, now the caretaker of a city written in his hand. The first pages I reread were about Theodora and Marozia, names that still travelled like rumours through Rome's markets. Leo had inked them with respect and caution. as if each stroke might tip a scale. Outside, the city wore the calm that follows a tempest. Leo VIII had steadied appointments. The emperor's men came and went like tides. Priests whispered of Cluny, of reforms that would tighten vows like belts. I walked Leo's route to the Forum, tracing the cracks he loved, then to the scriptorium where he'd once corrected my Latin by tapping the desk thrice. Rome, he wrote, was a room full of bargains. I added a line of my own. Bargains leave receipts. So I began to collect them, charters, decrees, street talk, pasting them into the ledger's blank leaves. If bias is a stain, then let the stain be honest, declared at the top of the page. That evening, I visited his modest lodging one last time. Between a lamp and a chest, I found a wax seal pressed with ivy, Theophylact ivy, stuck to the underside of a drawer. I could not tell whether Leo kept it as a warning or a memory. I folded it into a scrap of linen. Objects have their own testimonies. Sometimes they speak when we no longer can. I carried the ledger to the Aventine, where Cluniac monks lodged in borrowed rooms. Brother Anselm, a man with the patience of a millstone, poured me thin wine and spoke of a church too tangled in kinship. "We must cut the cords," he said, "or they will pull us where grace cannot follow." He did not spit the word simony, but it sat between us like spoiled bread. I told him Rome was tired of storms. He answered, "Storms cleanse." We walked the cloister, passing novices who moved like shadow and bell. He asked about the city's appetite for austerity. "Rome likes miracles," I said. "Austere men rarely glow." He laughed softly. "Then let the work glow." He showed me their account of bishop appointments denied for price, and another of a priest whose vow had been exchanged for a nephew's advancement. Not scandal precisely, custom. And custom, Anselm warned, is the most polished chain of all. Back at the Lateran, I compared his notes with Leo's. My master had chronicled families as the engine. Anselm traced habits as the rails. Engines can be removed. Rails require relaying. I wrote a new page heading, How Habits Become Laws That Never Passed. That night, I set the ivy seal on the ledger's cover and watched the candle shrink. The seal symbolized a century of household governance. Cluny offered rule-based renovation. If the papacy was a ship, the families had learned to captain it. The monks wanted to rebuild the hull. Rome would not surrender to either easily. Reform arrived not as thunder, but as a hearing in a side hall, the kind of room where Rome files away its conscience. A priest named Pietro stood accused of bargaining a benefice in exchange for a cousin's appointment. He protested that the world had always turned this way, that he had greased a hinge everyone used. The tribunal's clerk read edicts issued after Otto's reforms, appointments to be made for merit, not money, vows to be guarded like borders. I watched faces more than words, how canons flinched when the price of old favours was spoken aloud, how the public shifted between pity and relief, as if a stone long tolerated in their shoe was finally being removed. Brother Anselm attended without speaking. He and I shared the smallest nod. When the verdict came, suspension and penance, not ruin, I saw a path, reshape without shattering. The tribunal called it mercy. I called it strategy. After, I copied the proceedings into the ledger, careful to note not just the sentence, but the silences, who looked down, who smiled privately. Power was learning new ways to bow in public. Outside, Pietro wept against a pillar. I approached and offered water. "They'll say I was corrupt," he choked. "I fed 2 parishes." I didn't argue. Many truths can stand in a small space without agreeing. At sunset, the city felt fractionally different, like a room in which someone had moved a table by an inch. You only notice when you bump your shin, and yet, once moved, you do not move it back. news travels the empire on tired horses. Word came in 973 that Otto I was dead, the mountain felled by time. Rome did not wail, it recalculated. The market murmured, "Will the sun be iron or wax?" Otto II soon proved himself iron that still glowed from the forge. He sent letters precise as spear points. Continuity, discipline, the church kept whole. In the Lateran, I studied the imperial privilege charters. The clauses were neat, the intent unmistakable. No return to the days when a palazzo controlled the chair of Peter by dinner conversation. Yet the Crescenti, a new Roman house, began to gather influence. Cousins in cloisters, brothers at gates, uncles on councils. I felt déjà vu like a draft through a closed window. Rome loves its dynasties, the way vines love stone. I visited an elderly woman in Trastevere who claimed to have seen Marozia ride through the city in silk. Her memory was a tapestry with moth holes, but one thread shone. She looked like a verdict, the woman said. Not a person, a decision someone had made and never admitted. I wrote that line in the ledger and underlined it twice. As for the emperor, he remained distant thunder. The local weather was Roman. Taxes, patrols, disputes over wells. I learned that history is a long road paved with small stones. Each day's pebble of policy, each cobbler's complaint, each vow kept or shaved thin. Great names stride upon it, but the road is built by hands with ink and shovels. Leo had understood this. I was only catching up. The Crescenti set nets where Theophylacts had once hunted. They were more discreet, soft hands, firmer ledgers. In the papal palace, doors began opening for men with their surname or their debts. A priest confided, "They sponsor repairs to roofs and consciences." I thought of Anselm's rails, habit dressed as generosity. When John XIII, the Pope who had been imprisoned by Roman nobles before, worked with the empire to recover his seat, Rome learned another lesson. A pope with friends across the Alps is harder to trap. John's reign threaded reform with pragmatism. He trimmed the outer thorns and watered the root. In his wake, the Crescenti advanced, careful not to look like rulers, only neighbours who never leave. I sat one evening in a candlelit parlour with Crescentius the Elder, a man whose smile lived entirely in his eyes. He asked how the people remembered Marozia. I told him the Trastevere verdict. He nodded. "Verdicts can be revised," he said, "if the judges eat at your table." He meant it as wit. It struck me as a program. Back in my room, I lined up 3 seals: the ivy of Theophylacts, the eagle of the Ottos, the crescent of the Crescenti, and sketched them into the ledger like phases of a moon. Across each, I wrote habitus, the Latin for habit, but also for clothing. Power is a wardrobe. Rome changes garments to stay the same shape. Rumour ran that Benedict V had been raised to the papacy against imperial wishes. Then came the spectacle of his exile, a pope with dignity, but no chair. Rome watched with divided hearts. Imperial law gave predictability. Roman pride preferred autonomy with a little chaos for spice. When he was deposed, the lesson cut. Crowns sit at the intersection of consent and competence. Ignore either, and your head aches. A baker on my street asked, "Who chooses our shepherd, foreign steel or local cousins?" I told him the answer was being negotiated by letter and lance. He laughed. "I only need bread to rise." True, but bread rises in ovens built by law. I wrote that in the ledger, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. Some sentences require stuttering. I began to index patterns. Each time a family swelled, an emperor arrived. Each time an emperor pressed too hard, a Roman house revived. Between them, reformers slipped in like water, freezing slowly into policy so that neither side could easily chip them out. Call it gridlock, call it balance. Either way, it kept the ship from capsizing as often. At night I dreamed of Leo, who would tap 3 times and make me correct my tenses. "Write for those who don't know our names," he would say in the dream. "Make them see the street, the oven, the oath." I woke and described the baker's laugh, the smell of ferment, the way ash settles on a city after a political fire goes out. Reform widened its circle like ripples from a stone. Parish records were audited, tithes counted publicly, visitation tours checked rural chapels, where kin once ruled unchallenged. I volunteered to ride with a small team across the Campagna, fields flat as opened books. Our leader, Sister Agnese, wore a habit bleached by sun and carried a ledger that never lied. In one village, we found a shrine administered by a lay family for 3 generations, the altar rail polished by their elbows. Their patriarch argued, "We saved this place when Rome forgot us." Sister Agnesa agreed and appointed a deacon from nearby with the family's help. Compromise is a kind of surgery, painless only when the patient is already numb. Returning to Rome, I copied the visitations into the master register. Patterns again. Where families had been strong, piety often flourished, but accountability did not. The reformers weren't trying to destroy devotion. They were trying to number it, to make it auditable. Numbers lack romance, but they do let you find missing coins. That evening, I stopped by the ivy-sealed scrap and realized why Leo had kept it. It wasn't nostalgia, it was evidence. Our age would someday be called dark or bright by people born far away. They would need souvenirs from our crossroads. So I lit a second candle and made neat copies of everything we had done, in a hand so clear that even an enemy could read it and argue honestly. A man came to the chancery with a bundle wrapped in sailcloth, a cache of letters written by someone in Marozia's circle. He demanded coin. I demanded time to verify. We settled for an hour and a loaf. Inside were fragments, invitations, accounts for musicians, notes about guard rotations. No confessions, but logistics, the furniture of power. One note listed lantern bearers for a procession that never happened. Each name ticked in red. I traced the script. It matched no hand I knew, yet the effect was unmistakable. Anticipation organized into columns. People call it a dark century, I wrote, but darkness requires lamps. These families were nothing if not excellent at lighting their way. I showed Brother Anselm, who frowned as if at a child's clever sin. "Order is not holiness," he said, "but holiness without order becomes a rumor." We were beginning to speak the same language from opposite ends. I offered to copy the letters for Cluny's archives. He accepted, but only with my marginal notes about context. Documents without context are arrows with no flight recorded, only impact. Later, I walked home along the Tiber and tried to imagine Marozia as only a villain or only a victim. The river mocked the attempt. Water refuses single tales. It carries every story that falls into it and calls the merge a current. I resolved to keep writing people as currents, not statues. A bread riot in the Campo announced itself with a single overturned cart. Prices had crept, then leapt. The city's grain officer had cousins with grins too wide. The crowd wasn't wicked, it was hungry. I moved at the edge, listening to the song of anger, rhythmic, persuasive, nearly holy when it lifted all throats together. Soldiers came late and clumsy. The first blows made everything simpler and worse. Crescentius the Elder appeared not as a lord, but as a referee, hands open, voice calm, promising to roll back the latest levy and to audit the granaries. The crowd, surprised to be heard, re-knit itself into citizens. I watched him carefully, no theatrics, just competence performed in public. He was composing a memory for tomorrow's storytellers. That night, I checked the figures. The audit, if honest, could cut a few throats without drawing a sword. I wrote a private note. When nobles master theatre, They require fewer soldiers. Cluniacs would hate the sentence. Emperors would underline it. Bakers would shrug and look at the oven. In the ledger, I laid the riot beside decree excerpts about just weights and transparent granaries. What shakes a papacy often starts at a scale in a market. If a shepherd cannot protect bread from cousins, why trust him with souls? Reform did not rise from altars alone. It rose from loaves. I made a pilgrimage to Monte Cassino to visit a friend of Anselm, Brother Romuald, whose rule combined silence with an ability to make leaders talk. He received me in a courtyard, alive with bees and discipline. "You hunt causes," he said, after reading a few pages of the ledger. "But causes breed like rabbits. Hunt consequences." He showed me their scriptorium, a room where noise had been taught to behave. "Every letter must be upright," he said, "so that the reader's conscience is not tempted to lean." I copied a page under his eye, and for the first time, I felt the weight of form as an argument. If our records are disciplined, perhaps our successors will be too. In the evening, Romuald told a story of a duke who donated lands when praised and retracted them when ignored. "We wrote both acts with the same tidy hand," he said. "When his sons read it, they kept the donation. The pen outlived his mood." I slept on that sentence as on a stone. Returning to Rome, I sharpened my quills and my standards. If a future age calls ours dark, let it not be because our writing was lazy. The papacy had been shaken by households and steadied by emperors. It would be reformed by clerks who refused to lie to the page. The Theophylact palazzo had aged into a lesson. Ivy still gripped its stones. The crest's plant had found purchase, even where the family's fingers had not. I gained entry through a porter who remembered Leo's kindness. Inside, dust revised the furniture. In a corner room, a panel had lifted, a hollow where documents once hid. Only a broken seal matrix remained, its ivy nicked by a chisel. Someone had tried to erase the stamp and failed. I rolled the matrix in a cloth and walked to the river. Erasure is a jealous craft. It never leaves happily. Rome, too, had tried to chisel away parts of its memory, calling an era dark, so that later sunlight would seem brighter. But the impressions endure, in charters, in reforms born as reactions, in the grooves of governance that households carved by walking the same path daily. I brought the matrix to Brother Anselm. He weighed it like a relic and then like a tool. "Keep it," he said. "Put it beside the eagle and the crescent. Let the ledger be a cabinet of means, not merely of men." A good sentence. I stole it whole. That night, I pressed the battered matrix into a lump of wax. The impression was imperfect. Ivy leaves cracked where the chisel had bitten. I glued it into the ledger just the same. Imperfect records are still records, and history is mostly that. A letter arrived, bearing the imperial eagle, requesting copies of our tribunal records and visitations. The emperor, now Otto II, then Otto III in time, wanted evidence to guide appointments. I felt pride and dread. Pride, because our work had grown teeth. Dread, because the bite might be imperial. I consulted Crescentius the elder, who stroked his beard as if coaxing wisdom from it. "Give them what is true," he said. "Truth binds everyone. Lies bind only the liar." We prepared the packet, fair copies, indexes, my marginal notes about context and custom. I added a private essay on how family governance shook the papacy, how it forced us to build procedures sturdy enough to resist dinners and nephews. I did not flatter, I did not scold. I wrote as Leo taught. Describe what the page can prove. Before sealing, I visited Sister Agnesa to ask a final question. "Do reforms last?" She smiled. "Nothing lasts, but some things repeat less often." Good enough. We sealed the bundle with the Lateran's signet. I watched the wax cool, remembering the ivy, the eagle, the crescent, all of them tools that had tried to make Rome in their image. As the courier rode north, I felt the story tilt into its next act. The ledger was heavier now, not just with pages, but with consequences, of tribunals, visitations, riots calmed, letters answered. If the so-called Pornocracy shook the Papacy, then this was the shake's aftersound, the slow, stubborn settling of institutions choosing bones over breath. The packet we sent north returned as an echo with a crown. Word spread that the young Otto III, barely bearded, bright as a new coin, wanted not only to keep Rome steady, but to renew it. Courtiers murmured a phrase in his Latin, Renovatio Imperii. I tasted both hope and hubris in the syllables. In the chancery I held his rescript, measured, almost youthful in its certainty, requesting additional copies of tribunal rulings and visitor reports. He wanted evidence to build policy, not rumour to build pageantry. Crescentius the elder listened to the letter with the patience of an old cat. In youth, he said, even the map is daring. I asked if he feared a German boy emperor with a Roman dream. He smiled. Boys become men faster than cities change their minds. Behind him, his nephew, Crescentius the younger, leaned in the doorway, already the shape of tomorrow's trouble. I answered Otto's rescript with copies as clean as confession and a memorandum that read like a mirror. When households govern, the papacy becomes an heirloom. When emperors colonize, it becomes a department. The reformers say it should be a rule. We had tried all three and bled each. That afternoon, Sister Agnesi stopped by with a basket of figs. Renewal, she warned, arrives wearing zeal. Ask it to show you its ledgers, not its banners. I promised to keep the ledger open on the table. She tapped it once, as Leo had, and was gone. At dusk I crossed the bridge. The Tiber kept its counsel, carrying old leaves toward a sea none of us would see. When I looked back, a thin moon hung over the city like an unsealed wafer. Renewal or repetition? Rome has a sacrament for both. A rumour entered the city with the dust. A scholar from Aurillac, famed for a mind that could count to the edge of the world. His name was Gerber, and men whispered he could train kings to think like abbots, and abbots to plan like kings. I met him only as an outline, a letter requesting older tax lists to study the arteries of Rome. Numbers, his scribe explained, teach humility. They don't lie, they only wait. I visited the Schola Francorum, where foreign clerics debated decimals without naming them and tapped counting boards like cautious drummers. They did not talk about families. They talked about flows, grain, coins, oaths. In the ledger I wrote, if reform is a spine, accounting is the marrow. Crescentius the younger appeared at one of these sessions, smiling like a man who likes to see how locks are made. Scholars, he said warmly, keep us honest. He meant useful, if harnessed. The room chilled by a hair. Scholars prefer patrons who want answers, not alibis. At night, I drafted a paper to send with the next packet north, a chart of appointments and revenues across 5 years, noting each place where kinship had inflated a number or deflated a standard. I thought of Leo, how he would tap 3 times and say, make it legible to a tired man at dusk. I rewrote until it was. If Gerbert read it, he did not answer me, but weeks later a reply asked for more years. Always the mark of a serious mind. Ask not for praise, ask for data. In a city born of marble and memory, someone was tracing a different kind of map, one that could not be argued with once inked. When Otto III approached, the pavements tidied themselves. He rode into Rome with a pilgrim's eyes and an emperor's retinue, standards glossy with rain, helmets reflecting churches. He supported a young pope, Gregory V, blood of Bavaria, mind like a locked chest. The city watched two boys, one with crown, one with keys, attempt to carry an ancient table together. Crescentius the elder had slipped into prayer and portraits. The younger hosted dinners in which loyalty tasted like spice. Gregory's German entourage set tongues on edge. Romans prefer foreigners in the role of penitent, not vendor. Yet the new pope spoke of order, of clerical discipline, and, important for bakers, stable weights. My neighbours liked him in theory and grumbled in practice, which is how Rome often approves. I delivered a memorandum to the papal palace and felt the city's balance tilt. With an emperor in town, the crescenti smiled wider and counted slower. A week later, a magistrate with too many cousins was retired with gold and a blessing. Quiet surgery. At a small audience, Gregory V thanked our office for the tribunal copies. "We must teach Rome that holiness has a paper trail," he said, and I nearly smiled at hearing my own thought wearing a mitre. Otto stood beside him, like a column moved slightly forward, supportive, but ready to bear weight if the roof failed. The ledger gained a new page, boys at the table. I meant no insult. Youth can do what age cannot. Forgive debts, start ledgers over, believe that sober rules will hold. My job was to note who else believed. Power performs best on feast days. During St. Peter's Vigil, the city washed itself in candles. Gregory V preached reform with unexpected fire. Otto III knelt among the people long enough to be seen, short enough not to become a target. Crescentius the younger's men handed out bread outside the basilica, warm, crusted, memorably generous. Everyone wrote a page in someone else's memory. I stood with Sister Agnesi, counting loaves and glances. "The city is a theatre," she murmured, "but hunger is not applause." She was right. Beneath the candlelight, prices still bit, roofs still leaked, cousins still asked the church to hold their places in line. Reform had made rules. Habit kept making exceptions. After the vigil, messengers sprinted between palaces. The younger had not been invited to a council. Pride pricked through velvet. In the ledger I wrote, "When generosity fails to buy proximity, resentment collects interest." By week's end, a stream of anonymous complaints arrived at our office, detailing German heavy-handedness, papal arrogance, foreign neglect. The grammar felt professional. In a narrow lane, Brother Anselm warned me, "Be careful which letters you believe. Bitterness can counterfeit the truth." I asked how to test them. "Truth costs the writer something," he said. "Lies pay only the reader." I sorted the pile again and set aside those bearing risk. Signatures from men with something to lose. The rest I copied into a file named The Weather. The rupture arrived like a familiar guest. Crescentius the younger, seeing space open between emperor and pope, stepped into it with the confidence of a landlord. He gathered discontented nobles and unveiled a plan. Replace Gregory V with a man Rome could claim as its own. John, a learned Greek, pliable to Roman interests. Some called him John XVI. Others whispered anti-pope. Titles argue soldiers in force. Otto III left for the north too soon for comfort. The city's balances drifted. The younger moved quickly. Guard posts reassigned, petitions rerouted, sermons seasoned with civic pride. The letters I had filed under weather proved to be kindling. Crowds found phrases to chant. Banners found shoulders. I met Gerbert's scribe in a side chapel. "The emperor will return," he said, not as threat, but as calendar. "Bring your ledgers." I asked if numbers mattered when streets chose sides. He nodded. Numbers decide whom the emperor believes first. At the Lateran, fear organized itself. Gregory V fled. The younger fortified Castel Sant'Angelo, Rome's stone fist above the river. I wrote by lamplight as lists hardened into siege rosters. Sister Agnese prepared bandages. War, she said, is the city reminding us the body bleeds like the soul. As the first oil cauldrons were hauled up the ramparts, I tucked Leo's old ivy seal and the cracked matrix into the ledger's pocket. I did not know why. Maybe because every time Rome turns the wheel, the old spokes return. Or because I wanted the past present at the reckoning it had taught us to expect. The siege began with horns and ended often with whispered prayers. Otto III returned like a storm disciplined into lines, ladders, mantlets, engines dragged by oxen and will. From across the river, the castle looked eternal. Up close, it looked like stone that humans had to hold with food and sleep. That was our advantage. Hunger keeps fewer oaths than ambition does. By day, stones traded addresses. By night, negotiations pretended to start. Crescentius the Younger appeared on the battlements, a burnished figure against torches, promising endurance. In the field tents, Gerbert himself had arrived, thin, keen, a presence like a plucked string. He scanned our registers with the appetite of a general studying terrain. Your records, he told me, will keep the peace that follows this. Wars without documents only pause. Within the walls, John XVI's sermons floated over the courtyard like tattered flags. Outside, the Emperor's chaplains sang Te Deum with a steadiness meant to persuade stone. Sister Agnese moved between triage mats, counting heartbeats, ignoring banners. Hold the wound, she murmured to a young soldier. Not the grudge. I wrote that down. Some sentences belong on marble. On the fourth week, a breach yawned like an exhausted mouth. The assault was swift, the screams, brief, then swallowed by commands. I followed behind the surgeons, ledger under cloak, to note the surrender terms. The castle did not fall so much as exhale. Men who had been lions in helmets were suddenly fathers in sweat, wanting water. After sieges, cities hold their breath as if afraid to inhale dust. Crescentius the Younger was taken. John XVI found and dragged from hiding, disfigured by vengeance that called itself justice. I will not describe it. The ledger does not need the shape of suffering to record its weight. I wrote only, he was punished beyond the measure that teaches. Otto III presided with solemn economy. Gregory V returned to the Lateran, pale but steady, and Rome pretended that continuity had never hiccuped. But the people keep secret ledgers too, the ones where they tally humiliations. I heard murmurs that the punishment had stained the law that delivered it. Victory, like wine, can sour if stored poorly. In a quiet moment, Gerbert looked over the city from the terrace and spoke almost to the air. Rome multiplies extremes, he said. Holiness and theatre, cruelty and reform, all in adjacence. The problem is not passion, it is proportion. I asked who teaches proportion to men with crowns. He smiled without mirth. Time, and clerks who write well. We buried the dead without flags. Sister Agnese led a prayer as spare as the sky. I sealed a packet of the day's orders and depositions, then placed beside it a smaller envelope addressed to myself, to be opened when anger cooled. Inside I wrote, "Remember the cost of being correct." Rome resumed its noises. Vendors hawked, mothers scolded, pigeons negotiated every statue. The city has an indecent talent for normalcy. Perhaps that is why it survives. In the calm after punishment, Gregory V worked like a mason, steady, without flourish, repairing appointments, reconciling border dioceses, reminding abbots that their vows outranked their nephews. Otto III adopted the city as a classroom, speaking softly of a Christian empire where saints anchored policy. Gerbert taught at twilight. Lines of boys and men forming to hear mathematics offered like medicine. At one lecture, the air buzzed with an idea. 0 as a mark, a place that makes other numbers honest. Without a symbol for nothing, Gerbert said, we miscount everything. I wrote in the ledger, reform needs a 0, a nothing that prevents excess. Maybe that 0 was law, maybe procedures that refused favours. As the months turned, the emperor and pope began to breathe in rhythm. The markets noticed, coin weights stabilised. A crooked inspector lost his stool. A tavern that hosted seditious talk grew lonely. I wouldn't call it paradise, I would call it competence. Rome warms to competence like a cat finds the sun. Before winter, Gregory V sickened and died, worn more by work than by years. The city mourned without theatrics, as if afraid grief would jinx the small, blessed order we'd found. The conclave moved quickly. Gerbert emerged as Sylvester II, the scholar on Peter's chair, the mind that loved numbers, now counting souls. He took the name that echoed Constantine's age, a promise and a gamble. In the ledger, I drew a circle and wrote inside, when the teacher becomes shepherd, the curriculum is mercy measured. We had survived family rule, imperial impositions, and a rebellion's cruelty. Now we would try learning. Sylvester II and Otto III dreamed in concentric circles. The emperor spoke of a Christian commonwealth centered in Rome, not by garrisons, but by reverence. The Pope sketched a church measured by canonical procedure, not cousinage. It felt like a renovation of meanings. Emperor as penitent and protector, Pope as judge who smiled only at good paperwork. Projects sprouted, archives cleaned, relic translations dignified, a census piloted for parishes long treated as private gardens. I drafted instructions that read like recipes: weigh, witness, record, repeat. Dull, Sister Agnese teased, and healing. She oversaw relief lists for widows whose husbands had left during the siege and never returned. Numbers again, as a mercy. Crescentius loyalists sulked, then adapted. A few joined the new machinery, others planned around it, reinventing favours as formal petitions. I didn't mind. If corruption wears a tie to work, it at least learns our hours. At a dawn service, Otto served as acolyte, holding a candle until his arm trembled. Beside him, Sylvester's voice unrolled like clean linen. The image must have travelled far, crown bearing wax, tiara bearing law. I copied the sermon and the schedule of the day's small reforms into the ledger. Leo would have approved. The heroics hid inside the minutiae. Sometimes Rome glimpses itself as it could be. Those mornings are dangerous. They invite pride. I walked the forum, reminding myself of the wax in the emperor's dish. How even a candle thins while giving light. Renewal is a flame. The question is, whose fingers burn? News broke like a dish. Otto III had fallen ill on campaign and died. Young, unspent. The air still warm where he had stood. Rome froze, then sprang into arithmetic. Who would come next? From where? With which appetite? Sylvester II absorbed the silence, like a stone absorbs sun. For a week he spoke little and signed much, ballast against panic. The crescenti gauged the vacuum as craftsmen measure wood. Some proposed alliances with princes whose Latin rusted in their throats. Others urged patience, letting the Pope carry the city's face until a new face arrived. I attended a meeting where men said the word prudence the way gamblers say luck. Sister Agnese took me to the hospice, where widows learned the kind of grief that has chores. Empires are loud, she said, wringing a cloth, but loss is always the same volume. I wrote a list of names for relief and realized formulas cannot hug. The ledger is honest, it is not kind. We rely on people for that. In private, Sylvester asked for our visitation records again. Stability now means documentation, he said. We must make Rome legible to the next man before he decides to redraw her. I composed a digest, not a story of greatness, simply a map of working parts, weights, oaths, courts, grain. At dusk, bells marked the emperor's soul as if sound could escort it. Rome listened, counted, adjusted. I sealed the digest with the Lateran stamp and before sleep placed Leo's ivy seal beside it. Generation by generation, we had learned a difficult truth. What shakes us most is not death. It is forgetting what worked. Vacuum invites imitation. With the emperor gone, lesser magnates turned their faces toward Rome. Crescenti cousins tested parlors for a draught of power. Envoys arrived with smiles hung on swords hidden beneath cloaks. Sylvester II answered them with appointments that looked like compromise and felt like deferral. Rome became a juggler who knows which knives are sharp. In the markets, life resumed its rickety music. The waits stayed honest, the tribunals kept their chairs, parish ledgers balanced more often than not. These were our small victories, and I held them like warm stones in a pocket. Sister Agnesa announced she would found a small house for orphans of the siege. No banners, just bread and sleep and schooling. Every reform needs a doorway, she said. This will be one. I offered to supply paper and ink. Good, she smiled. Then the children will learn to write their own days. A letter came from the north, respectful and cold, announcing new realities in which Rome would need to negotiate afresh. I copied it without commentary and went to the river at dusk. The water had learned every language brought to it by empire and departure. It translated them all into current. That night, I inventoried the ledger's artifacts: ivy seal, cracked matrix, wax impressions, edicts, and thought of Leo's sentence. Paper remembers. If the era once called Pornocracy shook the papacy, its aftershocks had taught us to build memory into the walls. Whatever prince arrived next would find not just a chair, but minutes of the last meeting. In spring, a boy stood at my desk the way I once stood at Leo's, awkward, hopeful, fingers ink-tempted. His name was Tommaso, and he had the posture of someone who had taught himself to read by candle smoke. "Teach me to write like you," he blurted. I answered, "No. I'll teach you to see like Rome." He frowned, then grinned. Some lessons open like shutters. We began with the forum, reading stones as footnotes. Which arch had paid for bread? Which column had held law? We visited Agnes's house, where a slate on the wall displayed numbers that meant sleep and supper to small faces. "Every number is a person," I told him. "Treat it politely." In the afternoons, I showed him how to sort letters into weather and risk, how to weigh signatures, how to distrust eloquence when the ledger is thin. One evening, I opened the cabinet and took out the ivy, eagle, and crescent, emblems of methods, not merely men. "These," I said, "are tools. Families try to own the keys. Emperors try to own the locks. Reformers insist on rules for both." He traced the cracked ivy with a fingertip. "Did they win?" I answered. "They taught." Before sleep, he copied a passage I assigned, the line where Leo wrote that Rome is a room full of bargains. Tommaso added in the margin, small and stubborn, and a few promises. I left it there. Apprentices must risk truth. If you ask why that dark century shook the papacy, here is my last page, because it forced us to invent memory strong enough to survive pride, because it proved holiness needs forms, because it taught the humble art of counting without losing mercy. Tomorrow, Tommaso will file the minutes. The chair will be the same. The room will be readier. Sylvester II faded like a carefully banked fire. No spectacle, only the quiet exhaustion of a mind that spent itself on order. Rome mourned with work. Elections moved at a clip lest factions discover their courage. The Crescenti watched from balconies, counting faces. The conclave chose John XVII. an elderly priest whose gentleness felt like a bandage over a bruise. He reigned for months, not years. Sometimes mercy is a wick too short. I, Matteo, kept the desk warm and the ink cool. Tommaso fetched registers, set seals, learned that transitions are built from verbs: appoint, confirm, reconcile. Sister Agnese brought lists of widows who'd outlived 2 popes and 1 bread riot. The ledger learned their names beside bishops. Put them where the eyes fall first, she said. She meant history should notice hunger. John XVIII followed. Quiet, administrative, a healer for parishes as tired as their priests. He conceded to certain Roman nobles the dignity of being consulted, and to the rule the dignity of being obeyed. I wrote his days like rainfall totals, not thrilling, but the fields drank. Crescentius envoys bowed, smiled, revised their afternoon plans. At dusk, I took Tommaso to the forum and pointed at the arch. See how it stands? He nodded. It has stood, I corrected. Tenses matter. Rome survives because clerks keep the past properly shelved. He laughed, then surprised me. And because widows' names are in your book. I had taught the boy to read. The boy taught me what to underline. We heard new names then, as clouds forming. Tusculum, hillmen with old wealth and new appetite. The word rode on mule carts with cheeses, and on lips that liked certainty. Families do not die, they molt. The city exhaled as John XVIII's paperwork made itself felt. Weights verified, boundaries mapped, a clerk assigned where a cousin once squinted. These were not miracles, only improvements. Rome accepts improvements the way old stone accepts moss. Crescenti influence dimmed to a weather front, present, shifting, short of storm. In that reprieve, we expanded Agnese's house. A second room became a school, its chalkboard crowded with sums that meant bread. I taught letters in the afternoons with Tommaso, who discovered a gift for explaining fractions by breaking loaves and measuring crumbs. You have a future in taxes, I teased. He grinned. Or in fairness. The two rarely meet. I didn't say it. A courier brought news of Saracen raids on distant coasts and of petty princes wrestling in mud they called honour. Rome felt these like aches from old wounds. John XVIII answered with letters greased by diplomacy and sharpened by precedent. He could not command, but he could remind. The ledger loves remembrance. So sometimes do princes needing a reason to be better. Evenings, Crescentius the Elder shuffled past our door, older now, a robe like a grey tide. He asked after the widows, nodded at the chalkboard, and said nothing about strategy. Sometimes even houses tire, but across the hills, Tusculum lit more lamps. Names murmured, Theophylact, Gregory of Tusculum. The city's appetite for dynasties is seasonal. Harvest was due. When John XVIII retired to a monastery, choosing silence over intrigue, I closed the day's entries with gratitude and dread. Gratitude for lessons that took. Dread for lessons we would need again. Rome rarely leaves the classroom early. Into the vacuum stepped Benedict VIII, Theophylact of Tusculum. A name that sounded like a cousin waking from old stone. He wore competence like mail beneath silk. Where Crescenti had stroked Rome, Tusculum gripped it. Petitions found new speed if they learned the hill road. Appointments carried a Tusculan cadence. Henry II's envoys arrived, stiff with duty and assured by maps. A German king seeking imperial coronation and calculating how much of Rome he needed to rent to afford the crown. Benedict weighed him as a butcher weighs ox, exact, unsentimental. I copied their terms until my nib dulled. Protections for papal lands, acknowledgements of imperial dignity, the usual clauses tempered by the unusual firmness of a pope who knew his city and his soldiers. Tommaso watched the palazzo and asked the right question. "Is this the old game again?" I answered. A remix. Families had returned, but the archives had grown teeth. Cluniac habits, market audits, tribunal minutes. These made Rome legible even to kings. You can tilt a map, but not a ledger that men trust. In 1014, Henry was crowned, procession precise, incense thick, dignity divided evenly like bread at a careful table. Rome saw an emperor not as a conqueror, but as a contractor, bound by oaths, looked at by auditors. I exhaled. Agnese brought her students to see candles reflected in helmets. They cheered when the bell pealed and did not understand why that mattered. Good. Children should cheer for bells first. That night, Benedict signed edicts against simony and clerical marriage with a pen that did not tremble. Reform had found a partner who liked schedules. Benedict VIII governed in straight lines. Pirates harried coasts. He commissioned fleets. Barons tested roads. He tested their loyalties. He wrote as if every clause were a stone placed on a wall. No simony, no wedding banns on clergy, no sale of shrines. If a cousin didn't like it, the cousin could learn to like it or learn to retire. I visited Tusculum to copy charters. The hills smelled of time and ambition. The Count received me with a host's ease. Who knows he sets the menu? His men drilled in a yard that had heard every Roman century in echoes. Tommaso catalogued seal types, which pleased the Count more than flattery. Knowledge is obedience to truth, the Count mused. He meant, obey our numbers and we will build you a safer Rome. A bargain. Many bargains are defensible if you read the footnotes. In letters, Henry II praised Benedict's steadiness. In practice, he respected the ledger that could embarrass him if he drifted. Agnesa took advantage, petitioning for a grain subsidy during a lean month. It arrived, not because she was owed, but because the forms worked. She stood in my doorway, smiling like a woman who'd seen a small miracle. "It is only paperwork," I said. "That is the miracle," she answered. At Vespers, I wrote a note to Leo in the margin of memory. The families returned, the rules remained. The Pornocracy had taught the church to expect households to muscle the chair. Reform taught the city to muscle back with process. The game was the same. The field had lines now. After Benedict's death, John XIX, his brother, a layman yesterday, rose to the papacy by sunrise, a reminder that habits molt slowly. Rome frowned, then watched. Would Tusculum turn the chair back into a family heirloom, or keep it as an office with rules? John took the hint history had underlined. He learned quickly, delegated better, left ledgers alone. He loved ceremony and understood economy. Markets kept honest weights, tribunals kept honest hours, and monks with strong opinions kept their letters. He treated the Cluniacs as indispensable auditors, which flattered them enough to be effective. Tommaso and I drafted a circular on parish record-keeping that spread like a new grammar. Towns wrote back, grateful for the instructions they didn't know they needed. In council, Crescenti men murmured about lay elevation turned mitred rule. I sympathized and added, "We have the minutes." Their faces bent like spoons. Minutes made family moves answerable. In time, they also made them palatable. If the Pope was a Tusculan, the procedures were Roman. Balance, for now. Agnese's house added a room for sick travellers. She asked for soap, vinegar and paper. The Chancery sent crates and a note of thanks. She pinned it to the wall so the children could see that writing changes rooms. I had taught Tommaso to file. Agnesa had taught him why. I wrote in the ledger, "Old sin in new vestments is still sin. Old structures in new discipline can be service." We had not banished families from Rome, ridiculous notion, but we had taught them to sing in key. We climbed to Tusculum again. this time to audit donations tied to promises of protection. The hall held the smell of beeswax and fern, wealth pretending to be a forest. Tommaso led the interview like a man who'd grown up in ledgers, which in a way he had. "Who witnessed?" he asked. "Where stored?" he pressed. The Count smiled as if at a falcon he aspired to hunt with. After, he walked us along the ridge. "This city," he said, pointing toward Rome, "loves fathers. When she runs out, she hires some." He gestured to our satchel. "You teach her to love rules instead," I answered. "We teach her to remember. Love follows memory." He nodded, perhaps filing the line under useful. Back in Rome, Agnese introduced us to Lucia, one of her older pupils, quick with numbers, quicker with injustice. "She corrects me," Agnese said, delighted. Lucia wanted to apprentice. Tommaso took to teaching with a patience I recognized as my own reflected. He put in her hands the cracked ivy impression, the eagle, the crescent, and said, "These are arguments in metal." She laughed. "Then I shall argue with ink." We three formed a small engine. I framed, Tommaso drafted, Lucia checked sums like a hawk. The office improved because an orphan understood columns. I wrote to Leo's ghost. Your widows' names became clerks. Meanwhile, John XIX played host to princes and prelates. Crescenti men learned to arrive with documents rather than hints. It was progress, not paradise. Men still angled for favors. They just used forms that left fingerprints. Pilgrims swelled Rome like a tide. Among them came kings, nut of the north among the more famous, seeking blessings, bargains, and the Roman premium on legitimacy. We arranged processions and permissions, measuring humanity in sandals and sincerity. John XIX greeted with the grace of a host who understood receipts, vows made here returned home, riding on letters with Roman wax. Lucia supervised a new pilgrim roll, recording names, origins, offerings, and requests. Data the city had always breathed, but never captured. "Why bother?" a guard sniffed. She pointed at a widow who sold water near the steps. "Because she will know whether to boil double tomorrow." The guard blinked. Logistics as compassion, a lesson that arrives late to men who guard gates. In a side chapel after Vespers, Tommaso wondered if the church had become a counter for sanctity. I answered, "Counters prevent thievery, sanctity benefits." He smiled, half convinced. Then we watched a prince kneel with a peasant in the same row. Counters can't count that. Good. Crescenti agents circulated, polite as moths, looking for wool. They found less to chew. Procedures made rooms less edible. That did not starve them. Moths are patient, but it slowed the feast. I wrote, "We are not saints, we are stewards. Stewardship is slow hunger management. Letters from beyond the Alps praised our role. A bishop asked for a copy to manage a shrine's influx. A queen sent alms earmarked for Agnese's house after reading that orphans learn to tally. The ledger widened into Europe and came back with bread. Whispers hardened into a name. Benedict IX. Young, Tusculan, rumour-fed. When he took the chair, the city tried not to flinch. Youth can be remedy or relapse. Early days were a pageant stitched loosely. Feasts generous, decrees delayed. Favourites appointed like flowers scattered without a pattern. The Crescenti stirred, discontented, opportunistic, while ordinary Romans measured rent and bread and found both unsteady. I kept minutes that read like coughs. Tommaso's jaw tightened. Lucia's pen scratched faster. Agnese sighed and said she would double the class time on reading edicts, because when the top wobbles, the bottom must learn to stand square. She was right. Good governance is distributed balance. Riots flickered. Market quarrels wearing politics as a mask. A delegation begged for consistency. The Pope's chamberlain promised with a smile that did not remember by evening. Tusculum counted loyalties, Crescenti counted doors. I wrote the oldest sentence in Rome. The city is looking for its adult. At night, I dreamed of Leo tapping thrice, describe, do not decorate. So, I described. I noted which appointments ignored norms. I stapled who thrived when rules bent. I glued receipts to the page like a man trying to weigh down a table in wind. This was not slander. It was gravity. Benedict's supporters called us prudes. His enemies called us prophets. We were neither. We were clerks refusing to lie to paper. Sometimes that is how reform begins again, because someone refused to make ink applaud. The year taught fatigue. Brawls at feasts leaked into streets. Favours wrote themselves into margins. A widow's petition went missing twice, then surfaced under a cousin's name. Lucia slammed her hand on the desk, then apologized to the wood. Tommaso visited Cluniac friends for counsel. They sent back a slim packet. Principles for election and discipline drafted in patient Latinity. Not for today, the note read, but for when today ends. We circulated the principles quietly, guides to choosing shepherds when households snarled the pen. Some bishops welcomed them as if the letter were water. Some nobles folded them like napkins and forgot them. Benedict IX did not notice, then pretended not to notice, then noticed enough to rearrange his adversary's errands. The air smelled of coming storms. At Agnesi's house, we hosted a small forum. Bakers, midwives, a carpenter, a canon lawyer, 3 monks, 2 widows. We asked, what breaks first when rules break? The answers filled a page and a heart. Prices, sleep, trust, memory. Memory? I asked. A baker said, when rules wobble, I forget how to be decent on market day. I wrote it twice. That night, I copied the election principles into a cleaner hand and tucked them beneath the ivy impression. If dynasties returned teeth, we would return teeth wrapped in parchment. Reform is patient weaponry. A feast day brawl cracked into riot. The Crescenti moved as if remembering a dance. Benedict IX fled Rome briefly. Rumours braided into ropes. Abdication, sale, return. I chose none and wrote facts. Departure, gate, hour, witnesses. Tommaso drafted a neutral bulletin for parishes. How to keep liturgies steady when the chair shook. Lucia updated the pilgrim roll with warnings about pickpockets who called themselves patriots. We could not fix the top. We could keep the bottom's lines straight. Agnese fell ill and refused fuss. I've had more years than bread riots, she quipped, lips dry. We brought her broth and minutes to read. She pointed at a line where a widow's relief had been delayed by a cousin's review. Circle that, she whispered. Delay is theft with manners. I circled it 3 times. A council convened in urgency elsewhere. Letters flew like startled birds. Names surfaced. Gratian, Suderic. Men with reputations for paying attention. I did not need them to be heroes. I needed them to be boring. Boredom is a blessing in governance. One evening, the ivy fell from the cabinet and cracked anew. I took it as an omen and laughed at myself. Superstition is optimism's drunk cousin. I pressed the pieces back into wax and left them there, broken but legible. That is our age. News travelled in 2 fonts, official, thin, and courteous, whispered, bold, and smudged. The official line, arrangements under discussion. The whispered line, Benedict IX would trade the chair for gold and quiet. I recorded neither as verdict, only as claims. Then a parchment arrived, bearing signatures that mattered. Resignations drafted, election cautions endorsed. The paper had finally learned how to say enough. Tommaso and Lucia assembled our packet, tribunal records, market audits, parish stability reports, the principles for election. We are not choosing, Tommaso said. We're making choice possible. Lucia tucked in Agnes's line about delay being theft. She smiled. Let them remember a nun scolded them into justice. We walked the packet to the courier at dawn. Agnesa, weaker, insisted on blessing the leather case. Not for victory, she murmured, for proportionality. I finally understood Gerbert's word years ago, proportion, the right measure of penalty to fault, power to responsibility, family to rule. That afternoon, a boy from Agnesa's house read aloud to her from our clean copy of minutes. He stumbled, corrected himself, kept going. Good, she whispered. Make the words behave. Men follow, slowly. She slept then, long and light, like a candle that chooses how to end. At night, the city was quiet in a way that suggested deals converging. The Tiber held its breath like a clock waiting to stamp. The answer arrived like rain after dust. A lawful handover, the chair seeded under ink rather than iron. The city's sigh was louder than bell peals. We would still argue about how and who and why Rome is hydra-headed in debate, but the how had been the hinge. Not siege, not lynch, signatures. Agnesi did not live to hear the bells. We buried her with the first roll of orphans' names she had written and the last circular she had corrected, creased, smudged, loved. Tommaso stood stiff as a new pillar. Lucia wept without noise. I read aloud her sentence about delay. Mourners murmured amen as if it were a psalm. In a city of thunderous men, our reformed saint had been quiet. The new administration moved to normalize. Audits resumed, councils met in the day instead of the night, and a draft appeared. Guidelines to limit family fingerprints on elections. Imperfect, yes. Enforceable, more than yesterday. I filed it beside the ivy, eagle and crescent, then added a fourth wax blob. No emblem, just the chancery stamp. What's that? Tommaso asked. Us, I said. The boring future. Lucia laughed through tears. At last. Toward evening, the Tiber looked like a ledger. Lines of light, margins of shadow, entries of boats. I wrote the day as if Leo were tapping thrice. Describe what the page can prove. Here it is. The era that shook the papacy taught us to tie storms to paper. We had not outlawed ambition. We had given it lanes. In the night, I left the office door open a finger's width, the city's oldest superstition that welcomes good decisions home. We called the new measures customs with spines. Parish voters would be heard first, cathedral clergy would record every step, and any noble patron had to sign a page stating exactly what he had, and had not, promised. Tommaso said, "We're cutting doors into walls," and Lucia answered, "and installing hinges that squeak when misused." We posted the guidelines in markets next to grain prices. Literacy and rumour did the rest. I, Matteo, felt the city lean toward legibility, the way a plant turns to light. We tested the rules in a small suburb where a patron insisted on tradition. Tradition, in his mouth, meant his nephew. We held a hearing in the nave. Parishioners, deacons, the patron, and our ledger open on a lectern like a judge. Lucia read the requirements. Tommaso walked through the steps. I recorded who objected and why. In the end, the patron's nephew withdrew, promising to study in a monastery and stand again one day. He looked relieved. So did the parish. That night, we copied the day's work into 3 books, parish, diocesan, and Lateran, and sealed each with the plain chancery stamp. No crests, the sacristan asked, disappointed. No, I said. Just the one that means process. When we left, women were chalking the names of candidates on the porch wall so their husbands wouldn't pretend to forget. Agnesa would have loved that. At home, I unlocked the cabinet and set the ivy, eagle and crescent beside the new, unadorned seal. The room looked like a conversation finishing its sentence. Families, emperors, procedures. Rome had made it to, and riders brought word that a king beyond the Alps approached. Clear-eyed, deliberate, a man rumoured to love order more than applause. Rome felt the air sharpen. Old houses checked their disguises. We began assembling a dossier. Minutes of troubled elections, charts of rents paid and promises kept, a map of which neighbourhoods stabilised when rules held. Tommaso drew the map. Lucia annotated the margin. Here, prices fell after audits. Here, thefts eased when rolls began. I wrote the cover letter as prayer disguised as prose. Sire, here is Rome when governed by favours. Here she is when governed by forms. Choose which city you wish to inherit. We included Agnes's sentence. Delay is theft with manners. Beneath the summary like a nail through wood. The king's herald arrived before the king, polite and hungry. What does Rome want? He asked, tearing bread. To be legible, I said. And loved, Lucia added. He nodded, half smiling. All cities want that. He carried away our packet as carefully as a reliquary. In the forum that evening, I told Tommaso a truth Leo gave me. Numbers and narratives travel together. One persuades minds, one persuades memories. We must feed both. He pointed at the map. This is both. He was right. The lines told a story of markets and parishes, of candles snuffed by rules and relit by care. Word came that the king would convene a great council to settle claims and clean houses. Rome, hearing the words settle and clean, reached for a broom and a shield. The council met in a town north of Rome, a place chosen for dry floors and wet ink. The king sat not like a conqueror, but like a man who refused to be lied to twice. Claimants presented their cases. Documents came first, reputations second. Tommaso laid out our minutes. Lucia turned pages to the sentences that bit. I listened for proportion, punishment that taught, remedy that repaired. When the king declared 3 rival claims void, simony proven here, violence there, confusion everywhere, he did it with reasons listed and records attached. The room didn't erupt, it exhaled. Then he proposed a new shepherd, grave, learned, not married to any house, a man who'd tolerate candles and detest bribes. I wrote the moment down as if writing would keep it honest. The new pope accepted with a face like winter sunlight, cool and welcome. In the ceremony that followed, the king never advanced past his line on the floor. Boundaries had become choreography. Remember this, I whispered to Tommaso. When laws learn to dance, swords sit down. That night, the king asked for a copy of the guidelines we had posted in markets. People obey what they understand, he said. Write it cleanly. We promised a fair hand by morning. Lucia added a column titled, Who Checks? And the king laughed softly. You Roman clerks, he said, are my favourite sort of rebels. We returned to Rome with a pope, a stack of endorsements, and the feeling of a door closing on the worst room in the house. Back in Rome, the new pope governed like a plumb line, straight, without anxiety. He reissued bans on simony and clerical marriage with clauses that landed like door bolts, names, fines, who checks, thanks to Lucia. Parish ledgers became uniform, not pretty. Tribunals started on time and ended before darkness. Boredom returned to schedules, and the city blessed boredom with both hands. Tommaso built a register of examinations, who took holy orders, where, with which witnesses. When a patron complained that his nephew had failed, the record showed why: a poor grasp of scripture and an excellent grasp of taverns. The boy studied and passed in spring. Rules did not humiliate, they tutored. We secured a charter for Agnes's house, now formerly the Hospitium of St. Agnes, with a modest endowment that smelled like soap and bread. The charter's last line read, "Students who learn to count shall be taught to write. Students who learn to write shall be taught to serve." I tucked a copy beside the plain seal and wept for the first time since her funeral. At Vespers, we three, Matteo, Tommaso, Lucia, stood under a fresco where saints wore crowns not of jewels, but of ledgers and scales. "Do you miss storms?" she asked. "Only the thunder," I said. "The rain we've kept." A week later, the Pope signed a decree establishing an archive room with locks, shelves, and a clerkship to be held by merit. He handed the key to Tommaso, who passed it to Lucia, who put it back in my palm. For the photograph of the moment, she grinned, and we laughed, a family without blood, bound by paper. Stability tests itself by surviving changes, so fate obliged. The new pope died on the road after visiting parishes that smelled of time and ink. Rome did not panic. The guidelines flowed like oil into a new lamp. The next election followed the book so closely it bored the gossips. In a city addicted to spectacle, boredom is reform's gold medal. We adjusted the electoral circle, more voice to cathedral clergy, clearer role for deacons who actually knew the parishes they served, firmer timelines. Lucia added a rubric. If disputed, consult the ledger. If still disputed, consult 2 ledgers. She explained, let documentation learn to agree with itself. Tommaso loved the phrase, the way a carpenter loves a square. A few nobles complained that the church had become a school, all rules and slates. I answered as gently as I could. Yes, and the lesson is trust. When they wanted favours, they arrived with petitions instead of whispers. We stamped many no, some yes, and all received. The stamp itself became a tutor in patience. At our niece's house, 2 older pupils, Marco and Sara, began assisting Lucia with copying. They wrote cautiously, then confidently, then beautifully, and I could feel the ledger's future grow hands. Each day ended with a small ceremony. The key turned, the door shut, the lamp snuffed. Ritual made safety visible. A traveller with quick eyes and a Tuscan accent came to the archive to study old abuses and new cures. He had the look of a man who could turn fire into policy. He spoke little, read much, and left notes praising our plain seal as the most eloquent emblem in Rome. Names matter, he said, but norms matter more. He would be heard from again. For now, he learned our shelves like a cat learning a house. The new pope, older, kindly, firm, convened a synod where he read out past scandals not as gossip but as curriculum. We laid on the table documents from the century that had nearly swallowed us. Oaths for boys to be popes, banquets that became sieges, letters that smelled of bribes. The room did not flinch. "We will not rehearse shame," the Pope said. "We will remember it. There is a difference that saves." After the synod, Lucia arranged our archive by a new logic. Causes, consequences, cures. "People look for stories," she said. "Give them structures." Tommaso built an index so clever a tired guard could find what a learned abbot might misplace. I sharpened quills, smiled like a grandfather, and wrote the day in 3 tenses. What was, what is, what must be. We began hosting lessons for visiting clerks. How to copy without bias. How to stamp without fear. How to say no in a way that teaches yes later. On the final day, the Tuscan traveller returned and said simply, "Good. Rome rarely gets that word without a price." We paid in ink. It was a bargain. Trouble arrived from the south, warlike lords, quick to kneel and quicker to raid. The Pope answered not with banners, but with summons and standards. Bishops to account for levies, abbots to produce receipts for rents, nobles to swear on paper before swearing on relics. War might still come, but administration would meet it at the door. Lucia compiled a war book, inventories of grain, mules, medicines, bandages. stored separately from tithe so that defense would not steal from widows. Tommaso coordinated with guilds, mapping carpenters to bridges and smiths to hinges. I drafted a preamble that made courage measurable. "Can you measure that?" A captain laughed. "Yes," I said, tapping the margin. "In loaves per march and wounds bound per hour." He stopped laughing. Raids nipped our borders, walls held, markets hiccuped and recovered. After each alarm, the war book returned to its shelf, updated, checked. The South learned Rome's new trick: paper teeth. Plunder hates receipts. At Vespers, Tommaso asked if we were still telling the story of a shaken papacy. "We are finishing it," I said. "The end of that story isn't a pope. It's a system that keeps any pope honest." He looked at Lucia, who pretended not to smile while labeling M for mules. That night, I walked the bridge where I had once watched Otto's fires and thought of Leo's first lesson. Write what you see. I saw a city that had learned to fight with forms, to forgive with records, to remember with rooms. The South could bruise us. It could not confuse us. Age arrived like honest weather. I woke with knees that argued and a heart that loved the archive more fiercely for it. Tommaso and Lucia worked with a quiet velocity that made me unnecessary in the best way. I began to write the manual of the Chancery. Not a law, not a sermon, just a how to stamp, how to copy, how to store, how to say we don't know and then go find out. We tested the manual by giving it to the most chaotic parish we knew. A month later, their records were legible, their disputes calmer, their alms predictable. The priest sent a note. "Your manual is dull. Thank you." I pinned it to the door like a trophy. Visitors came, abbots from the north, envoys from the west, a city clerk from across the sea, who wanted to know how pilgrims became numbers without losing their names. We showed them our rolls, our minutes, our war book, our orphan's ledger. "Who started this?" one asked. I said the names out loud. Leo, Theodora, Marozia, Otto, Gerber, Agnese, sinners and saints braided by necessity. He wrote them down, frowning with the surprise that villains can be classrooms. At night, Lucia checked my chapters, marking the margins with small, precise suggestions. Tommaso designed a finding aid. If you only remember a rumour, where to look first. If you only remember a year, which shelf to try. I understood then that my last duty was to leave well. I gathered Tommaso and Lucia in the archive at dusk, the key heavy and familiar. "Everything worth keeping," I said, "weighs a little." We opened the cabinet with the ivy, eagle, crescent, and plain seals. "These are not trophies," I told them. "They're warnings." Lucia nodded. "And instructions." I spoke the story one last time, how households had muscled the chair, how an emperor had set a line on a floor, how a scholar had taught us zero and proportion, how a nun taught us that delay steals, how a clerk named Leo refused to burn a draft and taught me that paper remembers. "Your task," I said, "is not to worship the past. It is to use it." Tommaso handed me a small bundle, the first printed sheets from a press a Lombard had set up near the market, crisp, identical, a miracle of many copies. "We can multiply dullness," he joked, eyes bright. I laughed until I coughed. "Multiply clarity," I corrected. "Dullness we already have." Before we left, we added a page to the manual. How to hand over, count keys aloud, name the rooms, bless the shelves, tell the story, then stop talking. I placed the key in Tommaso's palm. He placed it in Lucia's. She placed it back in mine for the last time. I turned it once more and felt the lock answer like a friend. We opened the archivum to the public one morning each week. People came as to a fountain. Widows checking relief lists. Guildsmen confirming contracts. Pilgrims reading their own names aloud like small miracles. Lucia designed a counter with 2 lines: questions and proofs. "Everyone brings one," she said. "Today they leave with both." Tommaso trained a team from Agnes's house, Marco, Sara, and 3 younger ones, how to greet, copy, and correct without condescension. The room hummed with the kind of noise Rome should always make: purposeful, mixed, human. A baker brought honey cakes and wrote, in shaky letters, "Thank you for counting me." I pinned it beside the priest's earlier, "Your manual is dull." A good wall tells the truth in 2 voices. I sat at a side table, a relic still useful, answering why more than how. An old soldier asked whether storm years would return. "All years return," I said, "but storms now meet walls, and walls have doors." He nodded, satisfied, and blessed the shelves with a rough hand. In the afternoon, the printer returned with test pages of the manual, legible, sturdy, smudge-resistant. Lucia insisted the chapter on no as a bridge to yes be set in a larger type. I approved, and the printer grinned. "Rome will now have arguments that cannot be misplaced," he said. When we closed, I watched Marco turn the key, then check the lock a second time without being asked. That small habit felt like a trumpet blown softly, the future rehearsing itself perfectly in time. We dedicated a modest hall to Agnesa, whitewashed walls, a slate as big as a door, a shelf where children could reach the manual and the rolls without asking. The Pope came quietly, without trumpets, and blessed the room with a prayer about bread, beds, and books. "These are the 3 B's Rome must never ration," he said, and I wrote them down because some sentences deserve frames. Lucia read a short history of our dark century, not scandal for sport, but memory for medicine. She spoke of Marozia and Theodora as women who taught us the cost of family rule, of Otto as a man who held a line, of Gerbert who taught proportion, of Agnesa whose ordinary holiness built a school, of Leo whose refusal to burn a draft made me possible. The children listened better than their elders. They always do when adults tell the truth without fear. Tommaso unveiled a timeline along one wall: storm, siege, council, archive, manual. A carpenter from the parish tapped the last plank and said, "Ad habit." We did, and everyone laughed because it was correct. Habit had saved us more than any hero. When the bell rang, it sounded less like victory than like continuity. I realized then that endings are simply places where we teach the next breath to keep time. We cut a loaf. Children carried slices to widows first, then to scribes, then to visitors. No one needed to be told. That was the point. I woke before dawn to the smell of rain and the small ache that says, "Prepare to stop." I walked to the archive with my shawl and sat alone until the city found its voice. Vendors clearing throats, a cart complaining, a bell impatient with night. Tommaso and Lucia arrived together, bringing the day's lists and the week's humour. "Master," she teased, "you're early for your own farewell." "Better than late," I said. We opened the cabinet one last time and set the 4 seals on the table. Ivy, eagle, crescent, plane. I told them what they already knew, that the story we began under shadows had ended in habits sturdy enough to carry any weather. "If anyone calls it a dark century," I said, "tell them it was a classroom, and show them your minutes." I signed the manual's last page and dated it, the cleanest line my hand had left in years. Tommaso read the colophon aloud. Lucia placed the first printed copy on the shelf, where children's fingers could reach it. We locked the door and checked it twice, because that is who we became. In the courtyard, a boy asked if the church would ever be shaken again. "Yes," I said, "but now it knows how to steady." He nodded like a man, then ran like a child, which is the right order. I gave the key to Tommaso, who gave it to Lucia. She did not give it back. The lock clicked. The rain began. Rome inhaled. I wrote a single sentence in the ledger's margin, where Leo once wrote mine. Storms tied to paper, power taught to count, mercy left in the margins for those who need it first. Then I closed the book.